me, I'm going to tell my story through my personal experience of curiosity, humility, and empathy in our culture war era. So I'm going to start by saying I am a product of the Chicago Public Schools. I grew up there. I went to Walt Disney Magnet School on the north side of Chicago, and yes, it is actually called Walt Disney. And many of us were very competitive, very studious, and like many, I went to a college prep high school in the city. And so I went ahead and went to Lane Tech. And for the most part, I loved my experience at Lane. I had a very multicultural group of friends, which was great. I participated in extracurricular activities, which I loved. And I had some great teachers who helped me learn to be my best self along the way. And unlike most people who, if you ask them if they do their high school experience again, will tell you absolutely not. I wouldn't mind doing mine again, because for the most part, it was a good experience. But even with that, there are some experiences that have stuck with me and that have not been the most positive. And honestly, when I think back on them, I realize it had an impact on the work I do around diversity and inclusion today. It's part of the catalyst for how I got to where I am today. So that story involves an individual. He and I were like oil and water. We didn't get along at all. And this individual also happened to identify as white. And it's funny because his sister and I were actually really good friends. We were friends through grade school, through high school, and she and I got along just fine. But he and I would bicker all the time. And one day I remember being in the cafeteria before the bell rang, before school started. He and I were in an argument, and he blurts out, "Why don't you go back to Africa?"
Oh my God.
Yeah, that look on your faces was the same look I had. And so you have to, in putting yourself in my shoes, here I am, this teenage young black girl in the city of Chicago with multicultural people all around me, and I'm hearing this from someone because I know his sister and I kind of know a little bit of their family history. I know he comes from an immigrant family himself. And he's saying something like this to me. Of course I was confused and not really sure what to do about that, especially being so young. Of course I was a little hurt. Even with someone who I went back and forth with all the time, something like that was still pretty hurtful. And of course, last but not least, I was definitely angry. Very angry to hear him say something like that. And when I think back to myself of who I was at that point in my life, I was still trying to figure out my own sense of black identity development. I was still in a space of color blindness, where I didn't see color, not really even my own, in terms of what it meant to be a black woman in a predominantly white society. I hadn't gotten to that point yet. So I didn't really know how to handle this situation. As I moved on through that and I went to college and I studied social justice theory and pedagogy, and I eventually started working in higher education in residence life, I was approached by someone who said, "Hey, I know you have skills in dialogue facilitation, and I want to talk to you about building a program that talks through difficult difference." And so we put this program together that talks about these three cultural pillars of how we can take these things to talk through really difficult situations like the one I just explained. So before I get back to that situation and tell you what I would do if that happened to me now, or what I would tell my younger self to do in that situation, I want to explain to you what these actually mean. Curiosity is first of these three pillars. It can be used to do a few different things. One, you engage in curiosity about yourself and others. So when you find yourself in these cultural war situations, it's really important to know who you are in the space that you hold. For me, if I'm using myself as an example, my intersection of being black and female is very important to me. It's something that impacts my life every day, and so I work really hard to understand what that means for myself. But even more so, I try to learn and have curiosity about others. So about other cultures that I don't know about, so that I'm at least aware of what's going on around me. Curiosity can be used to diffuse a tense situation. I find that if you're in the middle of a culture war moment and someone says something to you that makes you really upset, or you're trying to have that conversation, asking a question can bring the level down a little bit. It's harder to be angry at someone when you're asking them a question or trying to get information from that person. And last but not least, and I think for curiosity this is one of the most important, it can help you establish shared meaning. So if you think about a situation where you've been arguing with somebody and you realize 20 minutes later that you weren't even talking about the same thing, right? Like you weren't even on the same page. Curiosity can help you get to the bottom of that. And starting in a place of like, okay, we're on the same page, we're all talking about the same subject, so let's move forward from here. The next step of the 3 pillars is humility. And I tell people all the time when I practice this, humility is the hardest of the 3. Because it really requires you to do some introspection and self-reflection that in the moment of a culture war moment can be really difficult to do. First, you have to think about holding your beliefs lightly. And I say that very intentionally because we all have certain experiences, we all come from different places, and we all have deeply held beliefs. And that's completely and totally okay. But holding your beliefs lightly allows you to actively listen long enough to hear what someone is actually trying to tell you and process that information in a very intentional way. And so the litmus test I give people to use, if they're doing this well, is if you're engaged in a confrontation with someone and you're trying to listen, if you're practicing your rebuttal response in your head of what you're gonna say, you're not really engaged in humility at that moment and active listening at that moment, because you're not really taking in what the person is trying to tell you. And then last, asking yourself, is there something I'm missing here? Or was there some information that someone gave to me that I hadn't considered before? And again, this can be really hard, especially when you're very resolute in your beliefs and how you feel about something, asking yourself, man, did I miss that? And do I need to adjust my thinking, or do I need to adjust my point of view because of this new piece of information? That can be really difficult to do, but it's necessary in order to communicate in these difficult times. And last but certainly not least is empathy. So I'll start with impact versus intent. I think we've all been there, that situation where somebody says to you, you know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, that wasn't my intent to hurt you in that way. And we all know that comes from a very genuine place. And that's completely and totally fine, but we have to remember, it's the impact that we had on that person that ultimately is going to count. So no matter what our intentions may have been, one way or the other, how we made somebody feel is what matters in that moment. Not assuming what others need. We have a tendency to operate in thinking of the golden rule, so do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. But again, like I said earlier, we have different cultural experiences. And so what might work for one person may not necessarily work for the next person, which leads me to the third point of asking for what you need. And asking someone to display cultural humility for you. And saying, right now, this is what I need from you in this moment, based on what happened to move forward and to be okay. So, getting back to my story, right? This gentleman has just told me to go back to Africa. And I think to myself, if that happened to me now, or if I could go back and tell myself how to handle it then, I'd actually have to start with humility here and take a deep breath. Be like, okay, that's happening. Like, this is really happening, and I'm going to have to figure out a way to deal with this. The tougher part of this, when I think back on it, is we're both very young, and I'm developing, and so was he. And so even though I know he meant to hurt me in that statement, I also have to give him a little humility and leeway here, and maybe he didn't understand how severe of a statement that actually was. Because I don't like to speak for all black people, but I know many people who I've talked to will tell you that saying to a black person, go back to Africa, is like right below calling them the N-word. It's that severe. And in his own development, he may not have known that. And so I can have some humility there and understanding he may need more education on his part, which would have brought me to curiosity. And asking him, do you understand like the severity of what you just said? And that on top of that, it's somewhat hypocritical, given your own family history, right? And posing that question to him and trying to really engage in a dialogue with him. And keep in mind, I'm really upset at this point, right? So this is really difficult to do. But if you don't ask those questions, if you don't get to the bottom of it, you can't get to some shared understanding and some shared meaning in order to move forward. And then the last piece of this is empathy. And it's not so much when I think about it asking for empathy from him, but when I look back on it, asking for empathy from the administrators at my school. And in this particular case, asking for what I needed, which would have been holding him accountable. Because I look back on that experience and I think, I recall that our band teacher said something to him because we shared that class together. We were both in the band. So I recall that they said something to him, but I don't think beyond that there was any real discipline at all for what he said to me. I don't remember any of my teachers even coming up to me and asking, "Are you okay? Like, we heard what happened. Are you feeling okay?" To even confirm that the story was true. None of that took place. And so if I could go back to my younger self, I'd say, you need to go and demand some accountability and asking for what you need in empathy. And helping them understand through these other pillars why that's so critical, why that needs to happen, not just to restore the harm that had been done to me, but also for his sake as well. He needed to learn from that experience so that he would never make that same mistake again. I often say to the college students that I work with, this is the time for you to make mistakes. This is the time for you to learn from those mistakes. This would have been a good time for him to learn from that. Because Lord forbid he makes this mistake again as an adult. And what it could cost him if no one helped him learn this lesson along the way. At the end of the day, people are going to not necessarily remember what you said or did, but they're going to remember how you made them feel. And I like to say, when you use curiosity, humility, and empathy in tandem together, and it's hard, I cannot stress this enough, in these moments, whether it's a racial thing, or a gender thing, or a religion thing, this can be very difficult to do. But when you're in these moments and they're difficult, if you can remember how I make someone feel is important, but more so, if I've caused harm at any point in this discussion, in this debate, in this difference, what can I do to repair the harm? And these three pillars are a method, a very easy, rememberable method for you to be able to repair the harm when it happens, so that someone walks away from you. They may not walk away disagreeing. You may not walk away completely on the same page about the topic, and that's okay, because remember, we have deeply held beliefs, and that's fine. But if you gave it your all, and you walked away feeling like, okay, I did my best, I repaired any harm that I may have caused, and even though we don't see eye to eye, that's okay, but at least we did it respectfully, at least we did it as civilly as we could, that is what ultimately will matter. Thank you.
Questions for Tiye? Comments? Yes.
You know, he made a comment regarding your race. I've had so many comments at work and different places for being bald. I've been bald for some time. And those things do hurt at times. As I've aged, I realize now it's nothing to get upset about, but I still get comments. But I'll have to try this technique.
And it is a practice, trust me, it's something I have to continually work at every single day. And so it's definitely practice.
Good job.
So since you work in higher education, I was just curious, what are some things you do to help prepare minority students especially for that corporate culture and what to expect, just to help them be more effective in making the transition?
At that age, because of where they are with their identity development, I strongly suggest they work on learning about themselves and learning about others, because that's a good place for them to start. And once they're a little more advanced and they feel like they have that information, they know that, and they come to me and they have the burning questions that usually come up after a certain point, you know, once they're juniors and seniors and they're like, okay, I've explored this or this happened to me, now what do I do? I talk about this with them. Or when these situations come up and they come to me and they say, this happened and I have no idea what to do, I ask them, are you starting from a place of humility? Are you giving somebody the benefit of the doubt? Are you giving yourself the benefit of the doubt? Because humility can apply to yourself as well. And giving yourself the space, like I said, to take a deep breath, like if you need to. And so I use this to work through that, as well as some of the other traditional theories that go along with college student development. Yeah.
What about some of the schools that are basically all white? I mean, these kids don't have an opportunity. Can you go into schools like that, or is there a...
I think through those situations, it's helping them learn a lot of different things. And as I'm thinking through that in my mind, it's helping them learn what is whiteness. So there's a such thing as white identity development as well that has research that goes along with it. So again, in exploring self, helping students, particularly if they're white, understand what does that mean to be white in our culture. And I think with students who are white particularly, I think it's very important to help them understand the history of whiteness, particularly as it relates to history in the United States. Because that's very specific in terms of what we live in. There's racial problems all over the world, but the United States has a very special brand of it. And those students have to understand some of that history, to understand some of the baggage they're carrying with them that they didn't ask for, right? It's not their fault that they're white, right? They didn't necessarily ask for that, but they're gonna carry it with them. And so helping them understand, what does that mean? So when you do finally go out into the world and you meet other people who don't look like you or don't share the same values with you, how are you going to handle it? You can Google a lot. Like, there's a lot you can Google. There's a lot of books you can read. There's a lot of things that students who are, high school students who are white can do to help prepare themselves for some of that. But at the same time, some of it they're not going to really learn and know until they're in it and having to work through it. And then at that point, it's where are the support systems, right? To help them, to challenge them when they do things that potentially cause harm, particularly as it relates to race, and help them understand why it was harmful, but support them through the process of learning why, right? And getting them to the next step of saying this was inappropriate or whatever the case may be, but here's how you can repair that harm, and here's how you can forgive yourself for doing so, and make better decisions moving forward.
I think a lot of problems people just don't know each other. They don't know anybody that's different. And a lot of times you're more like somebody than you're different. Just really get down to it.
And we do, right? And I totally get that. I try to remind folks that we do have differences and they should be seen and they should be celebrated and they should be acknowledged, but we all have a sense of humanity, right? And this is really what this tries to get at, is seeing the humanity in another person, even through those differences and past those differences. Because we're all human, right? Like, we all have basic needs that need to be met, but because of the society we live in, there are some people who have had advantages for hundreds of years over others. And we have to acknowledge that as well. We have to acknowledge the pain that causes. We have to acknowledge when we have microaggressions and do things or say things that unintended, but the impact was hurtful, right? So we have to help our students understand that of, like, yes, we're all human, but we do have different experiences and they play themselves out in different ways. So how do we work through that?
But if you went to a mixed school, you would know those, the so-called other people aren't really that bad.
It's not.
You know what I mean.
Right, and I know what you're trying to say, and I know what you're trying to get at. But even in mixed, like, as I'll speak for myself, right, as a person of color who works in multicultural spaces, who works in predominantly white spaces, I still get microaggressed every day, right? Like, and people who know me and who know my character will still say things to me that I would never have thought they would said in a million years, and I still find myself working through that. So even though connection is important and reaching across those lines are important, I think it's important to remember that that doesn't necessarily solve all of the problem. Unconscious bias can seep into that and the things that we do and can still cause harm. And so I think it's important to remember that both are there and both matter.
I think this would be really awesome to teach. I know I've got a lot of gay and transgender students that have a really difficult time when people approach them or when they come out, and I think this would be great for, that population to learn too, in terms of how to respond to homophobic comments or, whatever. I think this is awesome.
Yeah, and it spans across different identities, and what I found is that you can really use this stuff, even when it has nothing to do with, like, a gender issue or an LGBT issue. It could just be, like, normal problems like people have with each other. But I totally agree with you. It can totally be used for that purpose, and learning how to act, really the empathy piece of learning how to ask for what you need. And telling someone, this does not work for me in this moment, or what you said was hurtful, and here's why it was hurtful. I need you to understand that. And if we're going to repair this harm, here's how I need to engage with you moving forward. And come to that understanding to be able to find that common ground to move forward. Yeah.
I was thinking that a version of this could be useful if you're somebody who's maybe witnessed something that was said that was not, appropriate or was discriminating or anything like that. Because I often think that at least personally, when I see somebody in pain or when I see something that's unjust, I do want to solve it immediately, and that's having the humility to take a step back and say, this is not my problem to solve necessarily. You can help, but being as it's not about you, what does that person need for them to feel supported? It's not my job to swoop in and solve anybody's problem, but it is my job to recognize that that was not cool. What can I do to help, and how can we, how can I support you in that process? So I'm just thinking there's a layer of what you just said for somebody who's maybe witnessed something like this and they want to do something about it without invalidating the person's experience and saying, hey, I'm going to solve this for you.
And that's a perfect place for empathy, because you take the humility to know that you aren't assuming what someone else needs from you or assuming that they want you to jump in and help solve the problem, but you're asking them, hey, I witnessed that, and maybe the first question from a curiosity standpoint is, was that harmful for you? I know what I saw, but it happened to you, so I'm just checking in with you. Are you okay? And if they tell you they're not, then the next question from that place of empathy is, what can I do? Is there anything I can do? Do you need me to be an ally in this moment? And if so, how can I do that to best serve you in this situation? So you're giving that person agency in their experience and agency in their decision making.